The city stank of blood and betrayal. The bells of Baelor's sept still echoed through the streets, but they weren't ringing for a coronation. They were calling for his head. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, lay on the cold stone floor of his cell beneath the Red Keep. His hands, once steady and firm, trembled with weakness. The jailer had given him water, stale bread, and nothing else. He had been here for what felt like weeks, rotting in the dark, waiting for the moment Joffrey Baratheon decided his fate. But tonight, something changed. A soft sound, barely more than a whisper, brushed against the heavy iron bars of his cell. Footsteps, then a flickering torchlight cut through the darkness. The door creaked open. Varys, the spider, moved like a shadow, his silken robes flowing around him. He carried no guards, no chains, only a look of quiet urgency. "My lord," he murmured, kneeling beside him, "it is time." Ned's throat was parched, his voice a rasp. "Time for what?" "For you to leave this place, alive." A flicker of something dangerous stirred in Ned's chest. Hope. Varys produced a small vial from his sleeve and held it to Ned's lips. "Drink this. It will strengthen you enough to move." Suspicion warred with desperation. "Why?" Ned demanded. "Why help me?" Varys sighed. "Because a war is coming, Lord Stark, and Westeros needs you alive more than it needs another martyr." Ned hesitated only a moment longer before swallowing the bitter liquid. The effects were immediate. His mind sharpened, the numbness in his limbs faded. He wasn't whole, but he could move. That was enough. Varys helped him to his feet, steadying him as they moved through the dungeons. The halls were empty, too easy, too quiet. Ned's instincts screamed at him. "They'll hunt me." "Yes," Varys said, voice smooth as silk, "but not if they believe you are dead." The halls of the Red Keep whispered with danger. Every flickering torch cast shadows that twisted like wraiths, and Ned could hear the distant sounds of revelry from above. Joffrey's court was celebrating his so-called justice, oblivious to the escape unfolding beneath their feet. Varys moved with careful precision, guiding Ned through the damp corridors of the dungeons. He led him past sleeping guards and through a narrow servants' tunnel. The air smelled of mold and damp straw. "How?" Ned muttered. His legs were still weak, but the elixir steadied him. "The Queen, she would never allow me to leave." Varys pressed a finger to his lips and whispered, "She doesn't know. The boy king wants your head, but Cersei wants you to take the black. I've convinced her that smuggling you to the wall is wiser than making a martyr of you." Ned's jaw tightened. "You expect me to run?" "I expect you to survive," Varys said simply. They reached a rusted iron door. Beyond it, the city lay in darkness, cloaked in the uneasy quiet of midnight. The streets of Flea Bottom stretched before them, a warren of filth and desperation. A hooded figure waited in the alley beyond. Ned stiffened. "Who is that?" Varys exhaled. "An old friend." The figure stepped forward, pulling back his hood. Jory Cassell. Ned staggered. His loyal captain, whom he had believed dead, was standing before him, eyes sharp, expression grim. "My lord," Jory said, his voice rough, "we don't have much time." Shock threatened to paralyze Ned, but there was no time for questions. He clasped Jory's arm, feeling the solid warmth of a man he had thought lost. "How?" Jory shook his head. "Later. We need to move. The city will wake soon." Ned turned to Varys. "And you? You're just letting me go." The spider smiled faintly. "This war is bigger than Lannisters and Starks. Live, Lord Stark, and remember, Westeros is watching." Then he was gone, slipping back into the darkness like a ghost. Jory pulled a ragged cloak over Ned's shoulders and led him into the night. The north was waiting. The night air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, ale and sewage. Flea Bottom was alive even at this hour. Drunks staggering from Taverns, beggars curled in alleyways, and whispers of treachery in every shadow. Jory led Ned through the winding streets, moving with the ease of a man who had spent years navigating the underbelly of King's Landing. Ned pulled his hood lower, forcing himself to ignore the pounding in his skull. He had spent too long in that cell. His body was weak, but his mind was sharpening with every step. "Where are we going?" Ned rasped. Jory kept his voice low. "There's a ship waiting at the docks. Captain is loyal, no questions asked. Paid in gold. We sail before dawn." Ned's heart clenched. "And my daughters?" Jory's jaw tightened. "Varys said Sansa is still in the castle. She's under the Queen's watch." Ned didn't need the hesitation in Jory's voice to know what that meant. A hostage, a pawn in the Lannisters' game. "And Arya?" Jory hesitated again, but this time there was something else in his expression. Something like hope. "She escaped." Ned stopped in his tracks. "Escaped?" Jory nodded. "Varys said she slipped away after your arrest. She's hiding somewhere in the city." A weight lifted from Ned's chest, even as another settled in its place. Arya was out there alone, but alive, and she was a Stark. She would survive. Jory gripped his arm. "We have to keep moving, my lord." Ned forced himself forward. He could not help his daughters if he was dead. They reached the docks just as the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The ship was waiting, a small, battered vessel with black sails, rocking gently in the water. A man stood at the gangplank, his face hidden beneath a hood. Jory whispered, "Captain Tomard, he's done this before." Ned nodded and stepped forward, then steel flashed in the dark. Jory barely had time to shove Ned aside before the first blade struck. A man in dark leathers lunged from the shadows, a dagger aimed for Ned's throat. Jory's sword was out in an instant, clashing against the attacker's blade. "Run!" he barked, but Ned didn't move. He wouldn't leave Jory again. More figures emerged from the gloom, 3, 4, 5 of them. Hired killers, their eyes glinting with cruel purpose. The Lannisters knew someone had betrayed them. Ned drew the dagger Jory had given him and braced himself. He was weak, exhausted, but he was still a Stark of Winterfell, and he would not die on his knees. The first man lunged. Ned twisted, barely avoiding the blade, and drove his own dagger up into the man's ribs. A gurgled gasp, a spray of blood. The assassin fell. Jory was a whirlwind of steel, cutting through 2 men at once, but there were too many. Another attacker grabbed Ned from behind, a blade pressing against his throat. Then an arrow whistled through the air. The man behind him shuddered and collapsed, a black shaft buried in his neck. Ned turned in shock. On the rooftop, above, crouched in the shadows, was a small figure with a bow. A girl. Ned's breath caught. Arya. She didn't wait for him to react. She knocked another arrow and fired, striking another assassin in the leg. The man screamed and fell to the ground. Jory took advantage of the chaos, driving his sword through the last attacker's chest. The dock was suddenly silent, save for the lapping of the waves. Ned looked up again, but Arya was gone. "7 hells!" Jory panted. "We need to leave. Now." Ned hesitated, his gaze scanning the rooftops. His daughter was alive, and she had saved him, but he had no choice, not yet. With a heavy heart, he turned and followed Jory onto the ship. As the sails unfurled and King's Landing faded into the mist, Eddard Stark swore an oath. He would return, and when he did, the Lannisters would pay. The ship rocked gently as it sailed northward, cutting through the black waters of the narrow sea. The salt air filled Ned Stark's lungs, but it did nothing to wash away the weight pressing on his chest. He stood near the stern, gripping the railing, staring back at the shrinking silhouette of King's Landing. Somewhere in that city, Sansa was still trapped, a prisoner of the Lannisters. And Arya, his wild, defiant little girl, she was out. And they're hiding in the shadows, alive, yes, but alone. Jory stepped beside him, wiping blood from his sword. You should rest, my lord. Ned shook his head. Not until we reach White Harbor. Jory studied him for a moment, then sighed. We'll be safe for now. The Lannisters won't chase us this far, not yet, not until they're certain you escaped. Ned turned to face him. That attack, someone knew. Jory's face darkened. Aye, someone told them. Ned's jaw tightened. Varys had helped him escape, but could the spider be playing both sides? Or had the Queen herself anticipated this move? Either way, it didn't matter now. We have to prepare for war, Ned said quietly. Jory nodded. Aye, and Robb has already begun it. That made Ned turn. What? Jory exhaled. Word came before I found you. The young wolf is marching south. He's already rallied the bannermen. He hesitated. He believes you're dead, my lord. Ned felt a deep, painful twist in his gut. He had known his son would not stand idle, but to think Robb had declared war already, how much had been set in motion because of his supposed death. How many men does he have? Ned asked. 20,000 at last count, Jory said. More will join. The Riverlands have risen against the Lannisters. The Freys, they could be an issue, but the Blackfish is gathering support. Ned's mind raced. If Robb had already gone to war, he had to reach him before more blood was spilled. And yet, Sansa, he murmured, she's still a hostage. Jory's face tightened. Aye. Ned exhaled. His heart was at war with itself. Ride north, join his son, and strike back at the Lannisters? Or risk everything to save his daughter? His decision was made for him when the captain approached. White Harbor ahead, the man said, pointing to the coastline emerging from the morning mist. Ned straightened. The north. Home. But home was not safe. Not yet. The ship docked under the watchful gaze of the Manderley banners. The city was alive with merchants and sailors, but as soon as Ned stepped onto the wooden planks of the harbor, whispers began. The dead warden of the north had returned. Within the hour, Lord Wyman Manderley himself greeted them in his great hall. The large man, draped in silks and furs, nearly wept when he saw Ned alive. The north mourned you, Wyman said, voice thick with emotion. But now the north will rise. Ned didn't waste time. I need to reach Robb. Manderley nodded. He marches south towards River Run. The boy fights like a wolf, my lord, and he wins. That was a relief, at least. But then Manderley hesitated. There is news, my lord. News from Winterfell. Ned felt an immediate spike of dread. What happened? Manderley's expression darkened. The Ironborn have taken your home. A deep silence filled the room. Ned clenched his fists. Theon Greyjoy, that boy had grown up in his halls, had been raised among his sons, and he had betrayed them. I must go north, Ned said. Jory frowned. My lord, Robb needs you in the war. Ned's voice was steel. Robb has his army. Winterfell has my sons. Silence. Then, finally, Jory nodded. Then we ride. Within 2 days, Ned and his men rode hard toward Winterfell, moving under the cover of forests and hills. The land was colder here, wilder. And as they neared the heart of the north, the signs of war became clearer. Burned villages, frightened farmers, ravens in the sky. Winterfell was ahead, but so was betrayal, and Ned Stark was done being a pawn. The wind howled through the trees as Ned Stark and his small band of riders neared the outskirts of Winterfell. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and blood. Proof of the Ironborn's invasion. Ned's heart clenched at the sight before him. The great walls of Winterfell loomed in the distance, but something was wrong. The banners that should have flown high, the direwolf of House Stark, were gone. Instead, the kraken of House Greyjoy flapped mockingly in the wind. He tightened his grip on the reins. His home had been taken, his people slaughtered or enslaved, And his sons, Bran, Rickon, were they still alive? Jory rode beside him, his expression grim. "We'll need to be careful, my lord. The Ironborn won't expect you, but they'll have the numbers." Ned nodded, forcing himself to think like a commander, not a father. "How many men do we have?" Jory exhaled. 24. Manderley sent as many as he could spare, but Robb has most of our forces in the south. Too few, but the north had never needed numbers to win a fight. It had needed steel, patience, and the will to do what had to be done. "We wait until nightfall," Ned said. "Then we take back my home." The night was cold, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. It was perfect. Ned and his men crept through the outer walls, moving through an old servant's tunnel he had used as a boy. The Ironborn hadn't found it, proof that they didn't understand Winterfell's secrets. The first kill was silent. A guard near the eastern tower, his throat cut before he could make a sound. Jory led a second group toward the armory, where they would secure weapons for the prisoners. Any Northman still alive inside these walls. Ned moved toward the great keep, his blood boiling at the thought of Theon Greyjoy sitting in his father's chair, the boy he had raised as a ward, as a hostage, but had treated with kindness nonetheless. Theon had repaid that kindness with treachery. He would answer for it. 2 more guards patrolled the corridor ahead. Ned struck swiftly, cutting one man down, as his companion barely had time to draw his sword. The second man tried to cry out, but Jory's dagger silenced him before he could. Ned wiped the blood from his blade and stepped into the hall. The doors of the great keep were unguarded. Either Theon was arrogant or foolish, or both. He pushed them open. Inside, Theon sat at the high table, drinking from a silver goblet, his legs stretched out before him. His men feasted around him, unaware that death had just entered the room. Theon turned, eyes widening as he saw the ghost standing in the doorway. "Lord Stark," he whispered, as if speaking to a phantom. Ned stepped forward, sword drawn, his voice cold as the winds of the north. "You took my home, Theon." The feast hall fell silent. Theon's men stood, hands moving to their weapons. Theon himself hesitated, his goblet shaking in his grip. He never finished his sentence. The doors burst open behind Ned, and the Northmen stormed in. Jory led them, cutting through the stunned Ironborn like a wolf among sheep. The hall erupted into chaos, screams, steel on steel, blood splattering the wooden floors. Theon scrambled backward, reaching for his sword, but Ned was faster. In one swift motion, he disarmed the boy and drove him to his knees. Theon gasped, staring up at the man he had once called his second father. Ned raised his sword. Theon's lips trembled. "Mercy," he whispered. Ned's jaw clenched. "Did you show mercy to my people?" Theon flinched, but then something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, regret. Ned hesitated. The boy had betrayed him, stolen his home, but there was weakness in him. A moment of doubt. He wasn't his father, Balon Greyjoy. He was still just a scared boy trying to prove himself. Jory stepped forward. "Do it, my lord." Ned exhaled. He had taken heads before. He had passed judgment. But this was different. Instead of killing Theon, he spoke. "You will stand trial before the North." Theon sagged in relief, but the judgment was worse than death. He would live to see the consequences of his betrayal. Outside, the Kraken banners were torn down. Winterfell belonged to the Starks once more. The North was his again. His sons were safe. Bran and Rickon had survived, hidden by loyal men within the crypts. But the war still raged. Robb was still in the south, Sansa was still a prisoner in King's Landing, and winter was coming. Standing on the battlements of Winterfell, Ned Stark looked to the horizon. He was done playing the honorable fool. The Lannisters had stolen too much from him. It was time to take back everything. The fires of Winterfell burned long into the night, but they were no longer the flames of conquest. They were the torches of mourning, of justice, of reclamation. The castle had been taken back, its halls cleansed of iron-born filth, but Ned Stark knew the war was far from over. He stood atop the battlements, the cold wind biting at his face as he gazed southward. His thoughts were a storm, of Robb marching deeper into enemy territory, of Sansa still trapped in the viper's nest of King's Landing, of Varya alone in the streets surviving on wits and fury. His home was his again, but his family was still scattered. Jory approached, his face grim but resolute. "We rounded up the last of the Ironborn. They surrendered after we took the Great Keep." "And Theon?" Ned asked. "Locked in the dungeons as you ordered," Jory said. "He hasn't spoken much." Ned exhaled, gripping the stone railing before him. Theon had been like a son to him once, but sons did not betray their fathers. "We march south," Ned said at last. Jory frowned. "To River Run. To Robb." The words were heavy, final. His son had gone to war believing him dead. He had declared himself king in the north, a title that had not been uttered in centuries. Ned had taught Robb to be honourable, to be just, but he had also passed down the same blind trust that had nearly cost him his own life. The boy was winning battles, but war was won in the long game, and the Lannisters played that game better than anyone. Ned would not let his son be another casualty of their treachery. The Northmen rode hard, a force of 200 men strong. The banners of House Stark flew high, the direwolf of Winterfell howling against the winter sky. Word of his survival spread like wildfire. Villagers came to the roadsides to watch them pass, murmuring in awe at the sight of Eddard Stark alive. Some cheered, others wept. The North remembered, and it had waited too long for justice. After days of hard riding, they crossed into the Riverlands, and the reality of war became undeniable. Burned fields, hanging corpses, smoke rising from villages long. Abandoned, Jory rode beside him. Lannister work. Ned's jaw clenched. He had fought wars before, but this was not war. It was butchery. River Run was close. And so was Robb. The Stark camp lay along the banks of the Red Fork, a sea of tents, banners and soldiers preparing for the next battle. Robb had taken the crag. He had taken Harrenhal. He had won every engagement against the Lannisters. But winning battles did not mean winning wars. Ned rode into the camp without fanfare, but the reaction was instant. Soldiers froze, gasps echoed. Men fell to their knees, muttering prayers. And then a voice rang out, raw, young, and filled with disbelief. "Father!" Robb stood at the entrance to his war tent, his auburn hair wild, his armor stained from weeks of war. He was taller, harder than Ned had last seen him. But in his eyes, for just a moment, he was still the boy who had bid him farewell at Winterfell. Ned dismounted. Robb took a step forward, his breath shaking, then another. Then he was running, and Ned met him halfway. The camp fell silent as Robb Stark embraced his father, gripping him as though afraid he might disappear again. Ned held him just as tightly, feeling the weight of all that had been lost, of Bran's fall, of the betrayal, of war itself. When they pulled apart, Robb's face was set with steel. "We thought you were dead." "I nearly was," Ned admitted, "but I am here now." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, "and we will finish this war together." Robb swallowed hard, nodding, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, of conflict. "You declared yourself king in the north," Ned said quietly. Robb straightened. "I had to. The North will never kneel to the Iron Throne again." Ned studied him. His son was no longer a boy. He was a king, a leader of men. But kings were not just warriors. They were tacticians, survivors. And Robb, despite his victories, was still young, still learning. "We have much to discuss," Ned said. Robb nodded. "Aye, we do." For the first time since the rebellion, the Starks were united in battle. Ned brought wisdom, Robb brought fire. Together they devised their next move. The Lannisters believed they were fighting a boy. They were wrong. They were fighting the wolf and the old wolf, and winter was coming for them. But even as they planned, their next strike, Ned's mind remained on King's Landing, on Sansa, on Arya, and on the vengeance still owed. The war was far from over. It was only just beginning. The moment Eddard Stark rode into his son's war camp, the tide of battle shifted in ways the Lannisters had not foreseen. They had believed the North to be leaderless, a boy king waging war with fire but without wisdom. They were wrong. Ned stood over the war table in Robb's tent, his hands steady as he studied the crude map of Westeros. The riverlands burned. The Westerlands lay ahead, ripe for conquest. But King's Landing was the heart of it all. Robb, seated at the head of the table, watched him with an expression torn between pride and hesitation. He had declared himself king in the north, and now his father had returned. The room was filled with lords and commanders, Roose Bolton, Great Umber, Edmure Tully. They had expected Robb to lead them, and yet none could deny the presence of the man who had once stood beside Robert Baratheon in rebellion. "The Lannisters will not expect us to strike first," Ned said at last, his voice calm but firm. "They believe we are still mourning, still scattered." He looked at Robb. "They do not know the wolf has two heads." Robb leaned forward. "Then we hit them hard." A murmur of approval rumbled through the lords, but Roose Bolton, ever the viper, spoke smoothly. "The boy, King Joffrey, holds your daughter in his grasp, my lord," Bolton said, watching Ned carefully. "To march on King's Landing is to risk her life." Ned's jaw tightened. He knew this. He had not forgotten Sansa, nor Arya, still lost somewhere in the city's gutters. And yet, he had also learned something in the darkness of his cell. The Lannisters did not value life. They did not honor their word. If he hesitated, if he begged for mercy, they would spit on him and kill her anyway. "No more hesitation," Ned said, his voice steeled with resolve. "No more honor." He turned to Robb. "We do what must be done. We march." The room was silent. Then Great Umber grinned, slamming his fist against the table. "The North marches." Cheers rose in the tent. Robb met Ned's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They would not wait, they would not beg. They would take the war to the Lannisters, and they would burn them to the ground. The Lannisters expected the Starks to play the defensive game, to huddle in the riverlands, protecting their fragile alliances. They did not expect the wolves to come for their den. Ned and Robb led their forces west, cutting through the Golden Tooth and into the heart of Lannister power, the Westerlands. Casterly Rock stood tall, an impenetrable fortress, but no castle was untouchable. Roose Bolton, cunning and calculating, devised a way inside. He found Lannister deserters, men disgruntled with their golden overlords, and turned them. One night, the gates of Casterly Rock opened from within. The wolves poured in. It was slaughter. The Lannisters had grown soft in their wealth. They had not seen true war since Tywin crushed the reins of Castamere. But the Starks had seen winter. They had known hardship, and they fought like men who had lost too much to lose again. Ned led the charge alongside Robb, cutting down Lannister. Knights, his blade swift and sure. The great keep burned. Gold was stolen, melted, turned into swords to be wielded by Northmen. The rock had fallen, and Tywin Lannister, still commanding his forces in the east, was about to learn that the war he thought he was winning had just turned against him. Word of Casterly Rock's fall reached King's Landing within days. The court was thrown into chaos. Joffrey screamed in fury, demanding blood. Cersei paled. For the first time she understood what she had unleashed. She had gambled that Ned Stark's death would secure her son's throne. But now, the man she had tried to kill was not only alive, he was winning, and he was coming for her. Littlefinger disappeared overnight. Varys moved in the shadows, whispering of a war lost before. It had truly begun. The people of King's Landing began to murmur. The Lannisters had never been defeated, but now their home lay in ruins. Their gold was stolen, and the wolves were howling at the gates. Sansa Stark, standing alone in her tower, felt the change. In the wind, her father was coming, and for the first time since she had arrived in this cursed city, she felt hope. With Casterly Rock fallen, the Northmen did not stop. Robb pressed eastward, cutting a path of destruction toward King's Landing. Tywin Lannister, desperate, tried to regroup at Harrenhal. But Ned was not the boy he had once dismissed. He was the man who had seen Robert Baratheon take a throne, and now he was ensuring his son would do the same. The Starks moved swiftly, ruthlessly, the Riverlands fully aligned with them. The Vale, once hesitant, sent forces at last, their banners, joining the march. And then, before the snows could fall, the wolves reached the walls of King's Landing. The city trembled. The battle for King's Landing was swift and brutal. The city, already on edge from riots and starvation, did not rally to its boy king. Instead, it welcomed the wolves. Gates were opened, the gold cloaks turned. The Lannisters were alone. Cersei, desperate and cornered, prepared wildfire. She would burn the city before letting the Starks take it. But Jaime Lannister, faced with the same choice he had made years ago, made it again. He killed his sister. Joffrey, abandoned, tried to flee. He was dragged from the throne room by northern soldiers. He screamed, wailed, cursed them all, and then before the eyes of the people, he was put to the sword. The reign of House Lannister ended not with a final stand, but with a whimper. And as the city knelt before their new rulers, Robb Stark stepped forward. The people roared his name, but Eddard Stark, standing beside him, knew better than to smile. The war was won, but peace was another battle entirely. The Iron Throne was broken, not taken, not claimed, broken. Robb Stark ruled as king in the north, Westeros fractured, the south consumed by its own chaos. The Starks did not kneel, they did not rule the Seven Kingdoms. They ruled the north and let the rest burn. Sansa was free. Arya returned from the shadows. Bran, the last of the Green Seers, saw the doom still to come. And beyond the wall, winter still waited. But this time, the north would be ready. For the wolves had returned, and this time they would never be caged again.